That's the first thing I remember about the night. Everything changed, the smell of antiseptic and old coffee, and the sound of my own name being called across a crowded ER waiting room by someone I hadn't spoken to in 8 years. I remember thinking, not here. Not tonight. Not like this. But that's not where the story begins. That's where it ends. Or maybe where it finally, after all that time, starts making sense. Let me go back. I grew up in a small house in Roanoke, Virginia, the younger of 2 daughters. My sister was 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand what attention looked like, I understood that most of it went to her. She was the one who got the car on her 16th birthday. She was the one whose grades were celebrated at dinner even when mine were better. She was the one my mother called first, always, every Sunday morning without fail, for as long as I can remember. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I say it because you need to understand the architecture of my family before any of the rest of this makes sense. My name is Rachel, and by the time I was 22 years old, I had been accepted to medical school at Virginia Commonwealth University. Full scholarship. I had worked for it since I was 15 years old, tutoring other kids for extra money, volunteering at the free clinic on Route 11, spending summers reading anatomy textbooks while my sister was at the lake with her friends. I did not come from a family of doctors. I came from a family of people who worked hard and expected little, and I had decided, very quietly and very stubbornly, that I was going to be the exception to that. The night I got my acceptance letter, I called home. My mother answered. I told her. She said, "Oh, honey, that's wonderful," in the same voice she used when the grocery store had a good sale. My father got on the phone and said he was proud of me. And then, almost immediately, the conversation shifted to my sister. She had just gotten a promotion at the marketing firm where she worked. And wasn't that something? Wasn't she just doing so well? I said yes. I said it was wonderful. And I moved to Richmond 3 weeks later with 2 suitcases and a used textbook on biochemistry that I'd bought for $4 at a library sale. For the first year, things were fine. I called home on Sundays. My sister would sometimes be there when I called, and she was always pleasant, surface pleasant, the kind of pleasant that doesn't invite you any further in. We had never been close, not really. We were polite strangers who shared a last name and a childhood bedroom and not much else. The trouble started in my second year. I don't know exactly what she told them. I only know what I eventually pieced together from fragments, a word here, an accusation there. A silence that stretched across months and then years until it became a wall I couldn't see over anymore. What I know is this. At some point during my second year of medical school, my sister told our parents that I had dropped out. She told them I had quit, that I had failed my boards, that I was too ashamed to tell them myself, that I was struggling. She apparently used that word a lot, struggling, and that she was worried about me, but that I had asked her not to say anything. She made herself into the concerned older sister protecting my dignity. She gave them a narrative that was completely, entirely, deliberately false, and they believed her. I didn't know any of this at the time. I just knew that my parents' calls became less frequent. Then they stopped returning mine. I left voicemails that went unanswered. I sent a birthday card to my mother and received nothing back. I told myself they were busy. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself that this was just the distance talking, that things would be fine when I went home for Christmas. But when I went home for Christmas that year, my mother greeted me at the door with a look on her face that I can only describe as careful, like she was handling something fragile that she expected to break. My father shook my hand, like I was a neighbor's kid come to shovel the driveway. My sister was there, sitting on the couch with her legs tucked under her, watching me over the rim of her coffee mug with an expression I still think about sometimes. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. She was watching to see how long it would take me to figure out what she had done. That trip home lasted 2 days. On the second morning, my mother sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, very quietly, that she thought maybe I should be honest with them, that she just wanted to help, that it was okay if things hadn't worked out the way I planned. I stared at her. I said, "What are you talking about? I'm in my second year. I'm doing well. I have a scholarship." She looked at me the way you look at someone who is telling you something you've already decided not to believe. I drove back to Richmond that afternoon. I cried for about 40 minutes on I-81, and then I stopped, because I had a pharmacology exam in 4 days, and I did not have the time. That was the choice I made. I could have fought it then. I could have called home every day and argued my case and sent them my grades and my enrollment records and my scholarship letters. I could have demanded my sister explain herself. Instead, I made a decision that I have had 8 years to examine from every angle, and I still believe it was the right one. I decided that I would prove it with my life, and not with my words. I stopped calling home. I threw myself into school with the kind of focus that only comes from having nothing else. I studied. I did my rotations. I made friends slowly and carefully, the way I do everything. In my 3rd year, I met a man named Daniel at a study group for our surgery elective. He was quiet and funny, and he brought terrible coffee to every session and apologized for it every single time, as if it were a surprise. I fell in love with him in the way you fall in love when you're 25 and exhausted and someone just keeps showing up. We got married in a small ceremony at a park in Richmond, just us and 12 friends, 3 years after we met. I sent my parents an invitation. It came back unopened. I graduated from medical school on a Thursday morning in May, and I stood in that auditorium in my white coat with my name printed on the front, and I thought about my mother's kitchen table and the way she had looked at me, and I walked across that stage and shook the dean's hand, and I did not cry until I got to the parking lot. Daniel was waiting for me by the car. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a cup of coffee, terrible, as always, and put his arm around me, and we stood there in the parking lot of the VCU Medical Center for a long time without talking. The residency was surgery. 5 years, brutal and consuming, and the best thing I have ever done. I matched at a hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina. We moved there in June, into an apartment so small that Daniel had to put his desk in the bedroom, and we ate takeout for the first 3 months because neither of us had time to learn where the grocery store was. I became good at what I do. I say that plainly, not out of pride, but because it matters to the story. I became a very good surgeon. My attendings said so. My patients said so. I could see it in the operating room, in the way my hands knew what to do before my brain caught up with the instruction. Surgery is, in some ways, the only place in my life where I have never doubted myself. Every other space, family, belonging, being known felt fragile and uncertain. In the OR, I knew exactly where I stood. 3 years into residency, I found out I was pregnant. Daniel and I sat on the bathroom floor of our small apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night looking at a pregnancy test, and we were both terrified and both trying not to show it, and he said, "Well, okay, we're going to figure this out," and I said, "I know," and we sat there a little longer and eventually got up and went to bed. Our daughter was born in the spring. We named her June. She had Daniel's nose and my stubbornness, and she was, from the first moment, the most uncomplicated love I had ever felt. Everything else in my life required translation. June did not require anything. She just was, and that was enough. I finished residency. I was offered a position at the hospital where I had trained. I took it. My name went on the door on the placard outside the office, which is less romantic but more accurate. Dr. Rachel Mercer, General Surgery. I was 31 years old. I had not spoken to my parents in 6 years. I had not spoken to my sister in 8. I thought about them sometimes, the way you think about a house you lived in as a child with a specific, detailed nostalgia that isn't quite longing and isn't quite grief but sits somewhere between the two. I thought about my mother's kitchen, the yellow curtains she'd had since before I was born. I thought about my father's laugh, which was sudden and loud and always surprised him as much as it surprised everyone else. I thought about these things and then I went to work, because there is always work, and work has always been the most reliable antidote to the things I cannot fix. On a Wednesday in October, I was finishing a 12-hour shift when my phone rang. The number was not in my contacts, but I recognized the area code, Roanoke. I almost didn't answer. I was standing in the hallway of the surgical floor, still in my scrubs, holding a cold cup of coffee, and my thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before I picked up. It was my mother. Her voice was different, smaller, like something had been pressed out of it. She said my sister was in the emergency room. She had been in a car accident on I-81, the same stretch of highway where I had cried myself dry 8 years ago on the drive back to Richmond. She had a collapsed lung and internal bleeding, and they were talking about emergency surgery, and my mother was asking, not demanding, not assuming, just asking if I could come. I stood in that hallway for a moment with the phone against my ear and the cold coffee in my hand, and I thought about all of the reasons I had to say no. There were many. They were legitimate. I had a full OR schedule the next morning. I had a daughter at home. I had 8 years of silence that had calcified into something I didn't have a name for. And then I thought, this is not about what she did. This is about whether I can live with myself. I called Daniel. I arranged coverage for my morning cases. I got in my car and drove 3 hours to Roanoke with a thermos of coffee and the radio on low, and a very specific kind of calm that I have learned to access in emergencies. The same calm that comes over me in the OR when something goes wrong, and the only option is to stay steady and solve it. The ER was crowded when I arrived. I walked in and gave my name at the desk and said I was Dr. Rachel Mercer and I was here about a patient, and the nurse looked me up on the screen and said they would let the attending know, and I sat down in the waiting room. That's when I heard my name. My mother was standing across the room in a coat I had never seen before. She was older, of course she was. 8 years is a long time, and she looked smaller than I remembered. And she was looking at me with an expression that I cannot fully describe except to say that it contained, all at once, recognition and shock, and something that I think was a long overdue reckoning with herself. My father was sitting in the chair next to her. He stood up slowly when he saw me. I was still in my scrubs. I had driven 3 hours from a hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had my badge clipped to my chest. Dr. Rachel Mercer, Department of Surgery. Neither of them said anything for a moment. My mother's eyes went to my badge, then back to my face. My father said quietly, "Rachel?" I said, "Hi, Dad." The attending surgeon found me in the waiting room about 10 minutes later. He was young, probably a second-year resident, and he looked tired in the specific way that surgical residents always look tired. And when he introduced himself and I told him who I was, something shifted in his posture. He explained what was happening with my sister, the injury, the plan, the risks. He asked if I wanted to scrub in. I said no. She was my sister. That was not a case I should be in the room for. I said, "Just take good care of her." He nodded. He left. I sat back down across from my parents. The waiting room hummed around us. Someone 2 rows over was watching a video on their phone with the sound on. The overhead lights were the particular flat white of hospitals everywhere, that color that makes everyone look a little unwell. My mother said, "You're a doctor." I said, "Yes." She said, "A surgeon." I said, "Yes." She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. She said, "Your sister told us you had quit." I said, "I know." My father made a sound that I think was the beginning of something, a word or a question or maybe just a sound, and then he stopped. He pressed his hand over his mouth and looked at the floor. My mother said, "We should have called. We should have, Rachel. We should have called." I said, "Yes, you should have." There's a particular kind of anger that lives so deep in you for so long that by the time it surfaces, it's quiet, not explosive, not the kind that raises your voice. The kind that just tells the truth without decoration. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I looked at my mother and I told her, calmly, what the last 8 years had actually looked like. I told her about finishing medical school alone, about walking across a stage in a white coat with no one from my family in the audience, about sending a wedding invitation that came back unopened, about having a daughter, their granddaughter, who had never heard their names spoken in a context that wasn't complicated. My mother wept. My father sat very still the way he does when he doesn't know what to do, and the not knowing was written all over him. I let her cry. I didn't comfort her. That sounds cold, I know. But I had done my crying on an interstate 8 years ago, and I had earned the right to just let this be what it was. After a while I said, "Tell me what she told you." "Exactly." And it came out, piece by piece, over the next hour. My sister had not just told them I quit. She had built it out over time, adding details, adjusting the story as needed, answering their occasional questions with elaborations that kept the fiction coherent. When I had sent the wedding invitation, she had intercepted it before my mother could open it. I hadn't known that until now. She had told them I was living with someone and not doing well, and that it was better to give me space. She had, for 8 years, tended to a lie the way you tend to a garden, pruning and watering and keeping it alive. And they had let her, because it was easier to believe the story than to pick up the phone and ask me themselves. My mother said, "We trusted her." I said, "I know. I also know that trust doesn't mean you stop asking questions about your own child." She flinched. Good, I thought, and immediately felt guilty for thinking it, and then decided I was allowed to feel it anyway. My sister came through surgery at 2 in the morning. I was still there. I don't know exactly why, partly because Daniel had told me to do what I needed to do, partly because June was asleep and fine, partly because, despite everything, she was still my sister, and I could not leave before I knew she was okay. The resident came out and found us in the waiting room and said she had done well, that she was stable, that they would keep her overnight for observation. My mother exhaled something that sounded like 8 years of held breath. We were allowed to see her briefly. My sister was conscious, groggy, her hair pushed back from her face, monitors beeping steadily beside her. She looked up when we came in. She saw my parents first, and then her gaze moved to me. And something happened in her face, a complex, rapid sequence of emotions that ended in something I can only call shame. I had imagined this moment before. Over the years, in idle moments, I had constructed conversations in my head, things I would say, how she would respond, the arc of the confrontation. In every version I had imagined, I was articulate and controlled, and she had to sit with the weight of what she had done. What actually happened was much quieter than that. I walked to the side of her bed. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I'm glad you're okay." She said, "Rachel." I said, "We're going to talk. Not tonight, but we're going to talk." She nodded. Her eyes were wet. I said, "Get some rest," and I walked out. My parents followed me into the hallway. My mother touched my arm and I let her. My father stood close without quite making contact, which is the most affectionate he has ever known how to be, and I understood it for what it was. He said, "Rachel, I am so sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the handshake at the door when I was 22. I thought about the unanswered voicemails. I thought about June, at home in Charlotte, who had never once been held by her grandparents. I said, "I know, Dad. I know you are." I drove home as the sun came up. 3 hours on I-81. The same highway, the same direction, the morning light coming in pale and thin over the mountains. I didn't cry this time. I turned the radio on and drank the last of my coffee and thought about my daughter, who would be waking up soon, who would want breakfast, who was completely and gloriously untouched by any of this. In the weeks after, things happened slowly. My sister and I spoke not once, not in one clean confrontation, but over several conversations that were uncomfortable and honest in the way that real conversations usually are. She told me things I had not known, that she had been jealous of me from the time I was 8 years old and had gotten a perfect score on a reading test, and my teacher had called home to tell my parents, that she had spent years telling herself the lie was small, that she was protecting everyone from an awkward situation until the lie was so large she didn't know how to undo it, that she was sorry, and I believe she was, in the way that people are sorry when they finally have to look at what they have done with no more distance between them and it. I did not forgive her immediately. I want to be honest about that because I think we do a disservice to people when we compress the timeline of forgiveness into something tidy. What I did was tell her that I was willing to try, over time, to rebuild something, but that it would be on my terms, and that my daughter would not be exposed to dynamics I couldn't trust. That was not a negotiation. That was the condition. She said she understood. My parents began calling on Sundays. The first few calls were stilted, careful, all of us navigating a space that had been empty for a long time and still echoed. My mother asked about June and I told her about her, the small, ordinary things that she liked dinosaurs and hated wearing socks, and had recently become obsessed with a picture book about the ocean. My mother laughed, and it was a real laugh, and I thought, this is going to take a long time and that's okay. My father asked, once, if he could come to Charlotte sometime, just to visit, to meet June. I said, "Let me talk to Daniel." I did. Daniel, who has the particular wisdom of someone who grew up in a family where people said what they meant and meant what they said, listened to me without interrupting and then said, "What do you want, Rach? Not what's complicated, not what's fair. What do you want?" I thought about it for a long time. I said, "I want June to have grandparents. I want to not have to explain to her someday why she doesn't have any." He said, "Then that's your answer." My parents came to Charlotte on a Saturday in April. My mother brought a stuffed animal, a small plush whale, because I had apparently mentioned the ocean book, and June accepted it with the solemnity that 4-year-olds bring to receiving gifts, turned it over twice, and then asked my mother if she wanted to see her room. My mother said yes. They went down the hallway together, my daughter and this woman she had just met who was her grandmother, and I stood in my living room and did not know, for a moment, what to do with myself. Daniel put his hand on my shoulder. I covered it with mine. Here is what I know now, on the other side of all of it. I am not the same person who drove away from that house in Roanoke in tears when I was 22 years old. I am also not someone who is hardened against the people who hurt her. I have found that those two things can be true at once, that you can be changed by what happened to you and still choose to keep moving toward something instead of away from everything. I chose medicine because I wanted to help people in the moments when they are most afraid and most vulnerable. That instinct, it turns out, did not stop at the hospital door. It followed me home, into the waiting room on that October night, into the hallway where my father apologized and my mother cried and my sister lay in a hospital bed having just narrowly survived a collision on a highway. Neither of them knew I had cried on 8 years before. I don't have a clean ending. I don't think real stories do. My sister and I are not close. We are in the early stages of something that might, eventually, become a relationship again. The way a fracture eventually becomes bone. It takes time. It takes the right conditions. And it requires both people to keep showing up, which is the hardest part. My parents are learning to know me. That is the strange, specific grief of our situation. We are not reconciling so much as we are meeting for what feels, in many ways, like the first time. They did not know me as an adult until I was already fully one. They missed the becoming, and that is something none of us can get back. But June knows their names now without complication. She calls my mother Grandma without hesitation, the way children do when they have decided a thing is true and then simply live inside that truth. Last month she drew a picture at school, her family, she told her teacher. There were stick figures labeled in her laborious kindergarten printing, Mommy, Daddy, and 2 smaller labels on 2 figures she had given gray hair, Grandma, Grandpa. I have the picture on my refrigerator. I look at it sometimes when I'm getting coffee in the morning, before the day starts, before June is awake. I look at it and I think about the version of me who drove away on I-81 at 22 with 2 suitcases and a $4 textbook and a choice to prove herself with her life instead of her words. I think she made the right call. I think she would be surprised, not that it worked out, because she was stubborn enough to assume it would, but at how much of it she couldn't have predicted. The husband who brings terrible coffee, the daughter who hates socks, the October night in the ER, the whale stuffed animal, the picture on the refrigerator. I think she would look at all of it and say, I didn't know it would look like this. And I would say back to her, I know. That's the thing about living forward, you never do.